He once told me that kindness could save the world, but he forgot that sometimes kindness itself needs to be saved. My name is Amber. I used to believe that love could keep people tethered to what was right. I used to believe that if I was simply good enough, kind enough, people wouldn't change. But then, one day, I stood under those bright lights, surrounded by applause, and I watched the man I trusted the most, talking about kindness as a strategy. He said, "People don't need to believe in goodness, they just need to look like they do." The whole room laughed and clapped, but all I felt was cold. He smiled at someone else with the exact same smile that used to be mine, and in that moment I understood. Not every light is warm. I'm not telling this to blame anyone. I'm telling it because I know too many people have stood right where I was, at that place where love turns into a wound, and silence is the only way to keep from shattering further. If you've ever had to pretend you were fine just to hold on to someone, please stay. Because sometimes all we need is a true story to remind us that we can still be loved. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can meet again in the next stories, where the heart is listened to with truth. The spring wind carried the scent of damp earth and fresh grass as I pulled over on the side of the suburban road. A group of volunteers was gathered around a stray dog with a leg injury. In the middle of the crowd, a man knelt, gently bandaging the dog with slow, steady movements. He didn't speak much, just lightly placed a hand on the animal's head, whispering a few words that calmed its trembling. The late afternoon sun caught his calloused hands, and in that moment, I felt something deeply trustworthy. It wasn't the kind of love that makes your heart race, but a feeling of profound, quiet faith, as if kindness itself had just touched me. I knelt to help him keep the dog still. The coppery scent of blood mingled with the wind, but he smiled anyway. This little guy has suffered enough. His voice was low, with a certain timbre that made you feel secure. As the dog was placed onto a blanket, I looked at him again. His brown eyes were bright in the sun, not the look of someone working for recognition, but of someone who truly believed in what he was doing. That evening, he helped my family transport aid supplies: bags of animal feed, a few crates of water, a wire cage. We only talked for about 10 minutes. He told me he was an engineer, using his weekends to support the rescue shelter. I asked quietly, "Don't you get tired? This isn't easy work." He looked at me, a brief smile crossing his face. I always believe that kindness is never wasted. I didn't answer, but from that day on his words echoed in my mind, like a song only I could hear. A few months later, I ran into him again at a charity fair by the lake. Wooden stalls were arranged in a circle, the smell of apple pie and coffee blending in the air. I recognized him immediately, still tall, shirt sleeves rolled up, carrying a crate for a blonde woman. He saw me too. A brief moment of hesitation, then he nodded a greeting, polite, as light as a passing breeze. I walked over, initiating the conversation, my voice slightly shaky but calm. "Still doing this work?" He nodded, the old smile returning. "It's a habit now. I'd probably miss it if I stopped." We stood side by side watching the puppies chase shadows in the sun. There was no drama, no lightning strike of romance. Just two people who had met amidst kindness, reuniting in peace. As I was leaving, I heard him call out softly, "Amber." I turned back. He raised his hand and waved, his smile warm. That entire afternoon I couldn't remember who had bought the items at my stall. I only remembered the light reflecting off the lake, a quiet light, like the beginning of something I hadn't yet dared to name. The next time we met, the sun was pouring down, golden like honey. I was cleaning a cage when I heard someone call from behind. Daniel remembered me. He smiled kindly. "I still owe you a thank you." I turned, the wind lightly lifting my hair, the scent of fresh grass mingling with his breath. "I don't recall doing anything to deserve thanks," I said, bending down to pick up a fallen leash. He replied softly, his voice low, carrying the warmth of an experienced soul. "Not everyone stays until dark, just to make sure that dog survives. I remember that." I looked at him, saying nothing more. Some things don't need an answer. They just need to be acknowledged and understood. From that day on, we began going on rescue trips together. Long roads, muddy ground, the truck shaking hard around the waterlogged curves. Daniel usually sat in the driver's seat, the radio turned low, an old Bob Dylan song drifting through the wind. I tied up feed bags, looking out the window, the afternoon light shining on his sweat-damp face. When we finally lifted a small dog out of the drainage pipe, it was trembling violently, its fur covered in mud. Daniel placed it in a blanket and patted its back gently. "Welcome to the world, Lucky," he smiled. I was surprised. Lucky? Yeah, because he's alive. And we were lucky to find him. We laughed when Lucky barked, a hoarse sound but full of life. That bark, somehow, eased all the fatigue of a long day. That evening we sat on the porch, holding mugs of ginger tea, watching Lucky sleep soundly in a wooden box. Daniel said softly, "I used to think kindness was a luxury in this day and age, but maybe it just needs to be nurtured by people like you." I paused for a few seconds, clearly hearing the sound of crickets in the grass. When I met you, I thought, I believed kindness could change the world. The moonlight fell onto the porch, filtering through the old curtain. Lucky stirred gently, his breathing steady, like the heartbeat of the night. I understood that some beginnings arrive not with a bang, but with a quiet warmth. The kind that makes you believe in people one more time. In the early morning, frost still covered the field behind the house. We worked together building kennels, rough wooden frames put together with rusty nails and patience. Daniel measured, I held. Sometimes the nails bent, and he would just laugh, saying, "That's our authentic signature." The scent of fresh-cut grass, wet wood, and the sound of barking blended into our own morning symphony. Lucky ran circles, barking and pulling on his leash. Our arms brushed lightly, our eyes met amidst the noise, brief yet strangely peaceful. We didn't talk about the future, nor did we feel the need to name what was growing between us. There was just the work, our breathing, and the light streaming through the tin roof like a warm current. At noon, Daniel held the syringe, his face focused. A puppy had a fever and needed an antibiotic shot. He turned to me. "Want to try? I trust you can do it." My hand shook, the needle trembling in the sunlight. He stood behind me, gently placing his hand over mine. "It's okay," he said, his voice low and steady. "They trust you already." I exhaled, the tip of the needle touching the thin skin. The dog whimpered softly, then lay still, its eyes wide open. I touched its head, feeling its tiny heart race. Daniel smiled. "See, it's fine." I smiled too, the first time that day. Maybe it wasn't just the dog that trusted me. Maybe I was starting to trust myself more. In the afternoon, clouds gathered in the west, painting the sky a pale gold. I sat looking at the newly built wooden kennels, the unpainted fence, and the sign that read, "Hope Shelter," which he had painted in slightly crooked white letters. The small rescue center was taking shape, amidst the open ground and the young grass. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. Each empty kennel felt like it was waiting for the creatures about to be named, about to be called ours. Daniel rested his hands on his knees, looking up. "I never thought a patch of dirt could become a home," I replied. "Home doesn't need walls. It just needs someone who won't walk away." The late evening wind blew through, carrying the smell of damp earth and hope. Lucky barked loudly, the sound like a first blessing for what was beginning. Not a grand love, but trust germinating in the light. In those afternoons, as the sun dipped behind the pines, we'd lean against the wooden fence, sharing a stale piece of bread and the thermos of warm water. No chairs, no grand plans, just two people tired from a long day, talking about dreams. Daniel told me he'd once wanted to be a photographer, but life had steered him into engineering. At least taking pictures of the animals now counts as a revived, unfinished dream, he said, his eyes following Lucky chasing shadows. I told him about my childhood with my father, about the abandoned dogs he'd saved. He used to tell me, "You can't save the whole world, but you can save a small part of it, and that part will remember you forever." Daniel was silent, then gave a slight nod. "That sounds about right," he said, his voice deep yet warm. The wind blew a few blades of grass onto my hair. He reached out to brush them off, his gaze gentle, almost shy. We sat quietly for a long time, watching the sunlight break over the ground like thin honey. Afternoons like that, so peaceful that I feared a sudden movement might shatter them. One weekend evening, when the whole shelter was asleep, Daniel sat on the wooden step holding a small ring tied with a piece of twine. No candles, no flowers, just the sound of crickets and the smell of moist earth around our feet. He proposed, simply, honestly. "I don't need much. I just need you to be here when everything else is quiet." I didn't answer right away. I looked at him, then at his thin but strong arms, remembering the first days we bandaged Lucky together, built kennels in the rain, and shared sips of water. Everything played back like a slow-motion film, a small life, but a real one. I nodded. The light from the oil lamp reflected in his eyes, warm as an old summer. We had nothing but the dogs, a few planks of wood, and an unnamed dream. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough. Outside, Lucky barked softly, then curled up and went back to sleep. I looked up. The sky was scattered with stars, silent and clear, like a quiet promise between two people who believed in the same thing. The sun was setting late when Daniel drove me to Salem, where he grew up. Bare-branched maples lined the roads, the wind carrying the scent of wood smoke and baked apples. He said, "My mother is a little rigid, but she just wants what's best for me." I smiled, trying to believe that, clutching the cold coffee cup in my lap. The house appeared at the end of the slope, a gray slate roof, white windows, and a small garden so perfectly trimmed that not a single leaf was out of place. As I stepped through the gate, I heard the wind chimes, their sound cold and clear, like a sigh of the wind. His mother, Evelyn, was waiting at the door, her posture straight, wearing a dark sweater, her eyes measuring every step I took. When we met, she smiled. So simple. Her tone was neither entirely critical nor complimentary, just enough to freeze the air for a beat. I replied softly, "I'm used to working outdoors, so I dress casually." She nodded, her lips curving slightly. "I understand. My son was like that too, until he regained discipline." Daniel forced a laugh. "Mom, I work with dogs, not in the military." She said nothing more, just turned and walked into the living room full of white light. A cold, perfect light, devoid of the smell of life. Lila, Daniel's older sister, emerged from the kitchen holding a glass of red wine, her smile as bright as a spotlight. "Hi, Amber, finally meeting the one who made Daniel cancel his donor meeting last week." "I didn't make him," I laughed, trying to keep my voice light. "Mom probably worries he's being taken advantage of," she continued, glancing toward Evelyn. The comment was sweet and sharp, not malicious, just a protective reflex, as if her love for Daniel was a precious asset that needed guarding. Daniel looked up, his voice low. "Lila." "Just kidding," she replied, taking a sip of wine. I smiled, letting the expression keep me from trembling, then looked down at my shoes, still carrying a bit of dried mud from the shelter. Dinner began as the sunset faded. The dining table was long, the dishes neatly stacked, napkins folded into swans. The atmosphere was taut. Daniel tried to laugh while I remained quiet. Evelyn poured the wine, asking me about my family, my job. I told her I worked freelance, supporting the small rescue organization. She nodded, her lips slightly pursed. That sounds interesting, but does it provide a stable income? Enough to get by, I replied. Lila chuckled. Amber has a heart of gold, and Daniel makes the money. Balance. Daniel sighed. You? I'm just kidding, she said again, but this time, his eyes weren't laughing. I looked out the window. It was about to snow. The glossy table reflected everyone's face. Evelyn calm, Lila cheerful, Daniel trying to keep the peace. And I, perhaps the only one who didn't know where to put my hands. Evelyn sliced the meat, the knife tapping softly against the plate. My son used to be too trusting, she said, as if recalling an old memory. Kindness is easily misunderstood. I nodded gently. But if we lose it, what do we have left? She looked up, her gaze resting on me, then said slowly, sometimes, kindness needs to be correctly placed. Daniel interjected, his voice soft. Mom, I think everyone is placing it correctly tonight. The table fell silent for a few seconds. Then Lila laughed, clearing the heavy air. Evelyn sipped her wine, nodding slightly, a reluctant agreement. I ate my last bite. The flavor was blander than I expected. In that moment, I understood the feeling of being seen but not truly looked through. There was something in Evelyn's eyes that made me realize. She didn't hate me. She was simply afraid I would pull her son away from her orbit. As we stood up, she took my hand, cold and light as dew. Thank you for coming. Daniel needs someone who knows how to keep him on the right path. I smiled, replying softly, I will try, ma'am. Out on the porch, I looked up at the row of lights in the front yard, golden light falling onto the steps, shimmering but lost. Daniel touched my back, whispering, Mom needs time. Just let things move slowly. I nodded, smiling, but inside, I clearly heard the wind through the trees. Our love was like this house, warm yet some windows didn't know which way to open. Night fell faster than I thought. Rain started pattering on the porch roof as dinner neared its end. The room was warm from the yellow light, but Evelyn's eyes still made me feel cold, a look mixed with affection and the fear of losing her son. Whenever Daniel spoke, she leaned in to listen, but when I spoke, her gaze just briefly scanned me, as if measuring what I might take from her. The meal passed beneath a thin veneer of politeness. Evelyn spoke about her husband, who passed away when Daniel was young, how he used to teach his son to be strong, to be the pillar, not the leaner. I realized, in her eyes, Daniel was not just a son, but the remaining piece of a life. And I, whether I wanted to be or not, was standing on the edge of that fear. I cut a small piece of cake, the sound of the fork hitting the plate dry and sharp. Lila was talking about her work, and Daniel nodded along obligatorily. When I glanced over, he gently took my hand under the table, his palm warm, squeezing lightly, as if to pull me back from the suffocating air between the three of us. He bent his head, whispering, "Just be patient." I pressed my lips together, nodding slightly. Patience. The word sounded both soothing and exhausting. It smelled like long days spent trying to smile when no one truly wanted you there. After dinner, Evelyn stood pouring more tea. Steam rose between us. She asked, "You like quiet places, right?" I answered, "Yes, where I can hear even the wind." She smiled faintly. "It's very windy here. I hope you can withstand it." Her voice wasn't harsh, but every word felt like a challenge wrapped in gentleness. On the way back, the car drove through the silent, sleeping neighborhood. Daniel turned on the radio, an old jazz melody playing quietly. He held the steering wheel, looking straight ahead, seemingly trying to reconcile two worlds, his mother's and mine. I rested my head against the window, looking at our reflection in the glass. Two young people sitting in the dim light, each carrying a family they hadn't fully understood. In the dark, I heard myself sigh softly. I thought they hated me, I thought. Now I realize they were just afraid of losing you. Because sometimes, love can be jealous. And amidst those quiet dinners, those seemingly distant looks, I understood. To truly enter a person's world, you have to learn to walk through the fears of the people who created him. That spring, our rescue shelter unexpectedly appeared in the philanthropy section of a local newspaper. The front page photo showed Daniel sitting beside Lucky, his smile kind and his eyes bright. The caption below read, "The man of the community." I held the newspaper, seeing his image bathed in the golden light of that afternoon. But something was different. Daniel read the article twice, then folded it carefully like a precious object. "See," he smiled, his eyes shining with pride. "Finally, this work is being recognized." I nodded, but a strange feeling passed through me. It was as if the simple thing we once did purely out of love was now being framed and labeled. In the following days, more strangers came. They brought cameras, questions, and donation envelopes. The calls, invitations, and interviews began to pile up. Daniel was still warm, still kneeling to bandage a dog's wound. But I noticed he started counting. He counted the shares online, the new followers, the unanswered messages. One morning, I walked into the office and found him sitting in front of a stack of papers. Food bills, medication costs, new contracts. The light shone on the desk, highlighting the glaring red figures. "The expenses are rising too fast," he said, his voice hoarse. "If we want to expand the kennel area, we need to take out a bigger loan or call for major donations." I pulled up a chair next to him. "Daniel, we can stop at this level. We can still save many animals without getting carried away." He was silent. His eyes remained fixed on the numbers. In the afternoon, we went to inspect the back kennels. The wind carried the scent of disinfectant and the distant sound of barking. Daniel paused, looking at the newly built row of enclosures. "There are still so many, Amber," he said, his eyes following an abandoned dog so thin its ribs were showing. "If I stop, who will save them?" The question, "if I stop, who will save them?" came out as lightly as a breath, but landed heavily in the space between us. I looked at him. His face, once serene, was now strained, his shoulders firm but looking weary. I understood his kindness, but I also knew kindness couldn't carry the whole world. "You can't save them all, Daniel," I said softly. He bent down, picking up a leash that had fallen to the ground, his voice low. "If we stop, how are we different from the people who abandoned them?" That statement silenced me. Above us, a flock of blackbirds flew across the pale sky. The wind swept past the fence, cold and dry. I touched his arm, but he had already turned away, speaking as if to himself. "Just a little more, and everything will be fine." I knew those words weren't just for the animals. They were for himself, too. That evening, as he dozed off at his desk, the yellow lamp covered the bills, which looked like a tangled bird's nest. I folded the newspaper and placed it next to him. His face under the light looked younger, but his brow was still furrowed. I clearly heard the wind on the porch, the rain mingled with his breathing, a wordless symphony signaling that something was slowly changing. And I suddenly understood. Sometimes the cracks don't come from a major event. but from a kindness that doesn't know when to stop. Sunday afternoon, Evelyn visited the shelter. She brought a basket of baked goods and a magazine with Daniel on the cover. This photo was completely different from the newspaper one. Studio lighting, a white shirt, a confident smile. I made tea while she sat observing our surroundings, her sharp eyes assessing whether this place was worthy of her son. Daniel was repainting the fence. When she walked over, he wiped his hands on a cloth and said softly, "Mom, look at that little dog. It was abandoned near the highway." Evelyn glanced at it, then spoke slowly. "You can't keep living off these sentimental gestures forever." He looked up. She continued, her voice even and clear. "You can't live on illusions. Life is not just about kindness, Daniel. You need to think further. Think about yourself." I stood a few steps away, still holding the teacup, steam rising between the three of us. Daniel didn't reply. His gaze flickered between me and his mother, between my reasoning and her reality. I clearly saw the struggle. On one side were the animals he had saved. On the other was the woman who gave birth to him, both loving him in a way that exhausted him. I set the teacup down on the wooden step. She's right. But if everyone only thinks about themselves, who will be left to save anyone? Evelyn turned to me, her smile thin as thread. "You will understand when you have children. No one can save the world, Amber." Daniel cut in, his voice low. "That's enough, Mom." She looked at him, her eyes softening, then sighed gently. "I'm just afraid you will lose yourself." With that, she turned and walked slowly toward the gate. As her car pulled away from the dirt road, I turned back to Daniel. He was still standing there, his hands smudged with white paint. The sun slanted, casting his long shadow on the fence. I walked closer, speaking softly. "Are you okay?" He nodded but didn't look at me. There was only the sound of the wind threading through the tin roof and the acrid smell of paint in the afternoon. "Maybe Mom is right," he whispered. "You know, sometimes I'm not sure who I'm saving anymore." I wanted to tell him he was saving the most beautiful part of himself, but my throat tightened. That night he sat writing the expansion plan for the shelter, his hand trembling slightly from fatigue. I looked at him, his back looking thinner in the lamplight. Outside the window, Lucky was curled up, occasionally startled by the wind. I realized what was slipping away was not just the peace between us, but the very person who had made me believe in kindness. I watched him drift away, I thought, as if the tide was pulling him out, slowly but irreversibly. Outside, the rain began to fall, tiny and cold drops. I gently closed the window, but the wind still seeped through the cracks. A wind that didn't wet the skin, only made my heart grow colder. The message arrived on an early summer morning. A major pet product corporation wanted to sponsor our shelter. They said they loved Daniel's inspirational story and wanted to make him the face of their new campaign. In exchange, they would cover all operating costs, from food and medicine to the expansion of the new kennels. Daniel read the email, his eyes lighting up, as if he'd found the ultimate escape. "Listen, this is our chance to do more. They can help us save 10 times the number of dogs we have now." I poured coffee, silent for a moment. The wind blew through the window, carrying the sound of Lucky barking outside. "I'm not so sure," I said softly. "They don't love dogs, they love money. And your kindness could easily become their sales pitch." Daniel was quiet. He leaned back against the wall, reading every line of the contract again, then smiled. "If they pay us so we can save more lives, it's worth it. I'll keep everything under control." I wanted to say more, but his eyes held a light I wasn't familiar with. The light of ambition mixed with the conviction that only he knew what was right. In the afternoon, Evelyn arrived. She sat in the kitchen, wearing a thin beige cardigan, holding a cup of tea. Daniel explained the partnership plan, and she nodded in approval right from the first sentence. "You deserve to be recognized," she said, her voice clear and proud. "You've done so much without any acknowledgement. Now is your time to receive. There's nothing wrong with that." I looked over, meeting her gaze. It was kind, yet somehow cold. "Mom," I said, "sometimes a spotlight doesn't just illuminate, it incinerates." Evelyn turned to me, a hint of sarcasm in her eyes. "Are you afraid my son will become famous?" "No," I replied, my voice calm. "I'm afraid he will forget why he started." The kitchen fell silent for a moment. Daniel stood between us, his eyes fixed on the coffee cup in his hand. I knew he hated being pulled in two directions, but I also knew the person he would choose to listen to was not me. That afternoon I walked out to the backyard. Lucky lay under the shade of a tree, lazily licking his paw. I sat down next to him, gently touching his soft fur. From a distance I heard Daniel's voice. He was on the phone, sounding cheerful. "Yes, I'm very interested. It sounds like a good step forward for both parties." I looked up, seeing him standing in the sunlight, his face radiant, his hand gesturing lightly, as if he were trying to convince the world. The wind blew through the kennels, the wooden doors creaking like a sigh. In my heart I suddenly heard a familiar sound, the sound that foreshadows what is about to break. 3 days later, Daniel signed the contract. I stood next to the old wooden table, watching him hold the pen, his hand trembling slightly. When the signature was complete, his smile was half pride, half apprehension. He held the paper up to the light as if it were a ticket to a new world, one where everything could be better, bigger, exactly as he'd once dreamed. "See?" he said, his voice full of hope. "From now on we'll have stable funding, no more struggling. They'll cover everything. We can hire more staff, open a new treatment ward," I cut him off, "and hang their logo on every single kennel. Daniel, you are turning kindness into a brand." He looked at me, his smile fading. "You think I'm doing this for the money?" "No," I replied. "I just think kindness when owned is no longer kindness." The air thickened instantly. The afternoon light shone through the window, splitting his face into two halves, light and shadow. I could clearly see the confidence in his eyes overpowering the doubt. "Amber, this is the only way to save more," he insisted, his voice hardening. "You talk as if I'm betraying something." "You are betraying the very reason you began." He put the pen down, the sound of wood hitting the table dry and sharp. "You don't understand," he snapped. Just 3 words, but they echoed like a deep cut through the room that was supposed to be filled with gentle light. The sentence was like the first crack in our little roof, not loud, but deep enough for the light to leak through and bring in the cold wind. We were silent for a long time. Outside the door, Lucky barked a couple of times and then stopped, as if sensing the tension. I poured more water into my glass, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just afraid you won't be you anymore." Daniel turned away, crossing his arms and looking out the window. "If you truly believed in me, you would understand this is the right thing to do." I looked at his back, those shoulders I used to lean on now seeming distant. Something in him was shifting. The passion that had made me love him was now a flame burning away all caution. That night he stayed up late on calls with the sponsors. I sat in the kitchen listening to his laughter through the wall. It was a familiar yet strange laugh, no longer the genuine bashfulness, but the tone of someone who was getting attention. On the table the contract was still open. I read through the fine print. Image usage rights, representative speaking rights, the right to reject content that harms the brand. I sighed softly. A person bound by rights. Even his kindness was being controlled by clauses. When he walked in, I folded the papers. "You read it?" he asked, his voice subdued. "Of course, I live with the person who signed it." "I thought you would trust me more than that." I looked at him for a long time, then only whispered, I trust you, but I don't trust the people behind you." He fell silent. We stood facing each other only a few steps apart, yet the distance felt longer than ever. Finally, he turned away, saying so softly it was almost a prayer, "I just want to do good, Amber. I don't know how else to prove it." I didn't answer. That night I heard the wind threading through the window frame. The moonlight cast a pale glow on the desk, covering the contract like a layer of cold water. I gently placed my hand on it, feeling the chill seep into my skin. I loved him enough to warn him, but all he heard was doubt. In the corner of the room, Lucky opened his eyes and looked at me. He didn't understand what was happening, but I saw in his gaze the thing I once saw in Daniel: absolute trust. And I knew, if that trust disappeared, we would be left with nothing but paper and words spoken too late. The sun rose earlier than usual that morning. The entire shelter was abuzz because a TV crew had arrived to film a documentary segment. 2 equipment trucks were parked right outside the gate. Staff spread cameras, microphones, and the sponsors' banners all over the yard. A blonde reporter with a perfect smile stepped forward to shake Daniel's hand. "We are so excited to meet the animal hero," she said, her voice bright and clear amidst the harsh lights. I stood behind the porch, my hands still smelling of disinfectant. Daniel adjusted the collar of his new shirt, smiling lightly, a mixture of embarrassment and pride. He walked through the kennels, leading the reporter to see each dog, recounting the miracle stories they wanted to hear. Every time he spoke, the camera panned to his face. The light shining on him made the sweat on his forehead look like glittering drops of water. As they began recording, I walked out into the yard, standing behind the fence, shielding my eyes from the sun. Lucky barked loudly, pulling me back to the present. I crouched down, petting his head, trying to listen to the interview from afar. Daniel was speaking in a familiar voice, but slightly altered, confident, fluent, knowing how to emphasize his words to make the camera crew love him more. The reporter asked, "What inspired you to start this rescue shelter?" Daniel smiled, his eyes directed at the camera. "Perhaps it's because I've always believed that kindness can save the world, or at least a small part of it." "And what is your greatest motivation?" He paused for a second, then replied, "It's faith. The faith that one small action can change someone's destiny." I heard up to that point, and my heart sank. Throughout the conversation, he spoke about the team, the donors, the challenging journey. But he never mentioned me once. Not a single we, only I. The camera panned, capturing his face in the glaring sunlight, while I was just a blurred shadow behind the fence, the one standing outside the frame. After the filming, the crew left amid laughter. Daniel waved goodbye, his expression a mix of pride and tension, like someone who had just touched a dream but hadn't yet grasped the cost. I walked over, offering him a bottle of water. "You spoke very well," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. He smiled, uncapping the bottle. "You should watch the show tonight. They said it's airing during prime time." I nodded. "You look different. More like the person they see on TV than the person I know." He shrugged. "Maybe it's just the lighting." As he walked into the house, I stayed behind, looking around the yard. Under the midday sun, the metal kennels gleamed, the sponsor's logo prominent on every plaque. Lucky slept on the porch step, his breathing steady, unaware that the world around him was slowly changing color. That evening when the program aired, I sat alone in the living room. Daniel's image filled the screen, his smile, his voice, his hand petting Lucky. The host called him an icon of modern compassion. I looked at that familiar face but felt like a stranger, as if watching someone else entirely. I wasn't angry, I just felt cold. Not the cold of the room, but the quiet chill you feel when you realize you have vanished from a story you helped write. I turned off the TV. Outside, the wind still blew through the trees, the sound of insects mingling with the whistle of the wind through the metal fence. The light from the screen lingered on the table, bright, fading, then gone completely. After the broadcast, Daniel's phone rang incessantly. Messages, congratulations, interview requests. The entire evening he was busy with calls and laughter. The light from his phone screen reflected on his face, so bright that I had to look away. That evening, Evelyn came over. She walked in, holding up the morning newspaper, which featured a picture of Daniel bending down to pet Lucky. "My son truly deserves this recognition," she said, her eyes welling up. "Finally, people see what I've always known, that he is not just kind, he is great." Daniel smiled faintly, a bit embarrassed. "You exaggerate, Mom." "No," she replied, placing her hand on his shoulder. "You have suffered for years. Now is the time for you to stand in the light." I stood next to them, smiling because I didn't know what else to do. Inside, I wanted to be happy for them, but something about that light made me ache. A light that no longer had room for two. Evelyn opened a bottle of wine, pouring 3 glasses. "To Daniel," she raised her glass. "To kindness, honored." I clinked glasses, trying to maintain my smile. The fragile sound of the glass hitting glass was like a thread about to break. After she left, the house was silent. I cleared the dinner table. The meal was cold, the meat dried, the sauce solidified into dull streaks on the plate. Daniel still sat at the table, scrolling through his phone, his face strained with a mixture of fatigue and excitement. I took the plate from his hand. "You should eat, then rest." He didn't look up, only said, "Just a little longer. They just sent a new cut of the show." I placed the plate in the sink. The only sound in the kitchen was the faint clatter of silverware, tapping against each other like the rhythmic beat of distance. I looked out the window. The backyard light still on, shining on the residual raindrops on the glass, each drop glittering like a small stage light. Daniel finally looked up, his eyes bright like a child who had just seen fireworks. "They said they might make a docuseries. Can you believe it? All of this. It's actually happening." I smiled, not wanting to extinguish his joy. But in my heart, the quiet question emerged. When that light fades, who will you be? I looked at him, the man who once knelt by the roadside, using his calloused hands to bandage a tiny creature, now sitting under white lights, his face radiant, like someone else entirely. When people are loved for the light they create, I thought, they forget who lit the lamp. On the porch, Lucky lay under the yellow lamp, his head resting on his paw, his eyes half closed. The light shining down made his fur shimmer amber, exactly the color of Daniel's eyes long ago, warm, true, and needing no one's validation. I turned off some of the lights, leaving only a small lamp on the table. The light was weak, but it was real. And in that light, I saw myself slowly becoming the only thing that was no longer visible. In the months that followed, everything moved with the speed of a summer storm. Daniel signed more contracts, an ad campaign for a pet food brand, then a line of premium dog collars, and finally, a deal to give inspirational talks at universities. Each time he signed, he flashed a bright, radiant smile, his eyes sparkling, his voice warm, as he told me about the new opportunity and the positive impact on the community. I listened, but something inside me was quietly splitting, like a silent crack that only spreads. Every morning, he wore a crisp white shirt, a tie, and cologne. The man who once chuckled softly amidst the mud and disinfectant now spent longer looking in the mirror, talking about brand image and professionalism. Once, I watched him stand in the shelter yard filming a commercial. His voice was loud, confident, and meticulously scripted. The dogs lay obediently around him, looking into the camera like little actors. And I, standing behind the fence, watched the man I knew slowly vanish. That afternoon, thunder rumbled. I brought him a raincoat as the ad crew was leaving.
The wind whipped up a large banner with his smiling face on it, a smile brighter than the real sky. I spoke softly, trying to stay calm. "You are selling your kindness, Daniel." He turned back, his face drawn from fatigue and annoyance. "Are you starting this again? Everything you're doing, are you sure it's for them or for you?" He scoffed, then slammed his hand down on the office desk. "I'm doing this for us. Don't you understand? For you, for this shelter, for everything we ever dreamed of." The sound of his hand hitting the desk made Lucky yelp loudly. The small room suddenly felt suffocating. I stood there, listening to my heart pound as if someone had just locked the door. He looked at me, his eyes no longer gentle like the first day, but full of fire. The fire of a person convinced only he was right. I wanted to say something, but the anger in his eyes silenced me.
Outside, the rain began, heavy drops falling onto the tin roof. Evelyn appeared in the doorway. I don't know how long she had been standing there. The hall light illuminated her face, half bright, half shadow. She walked closer, placed her hand on Daniel's shoulder, and whispered softly, "She doesn't understand you." The sentence was as light as a breath, yet loud enough for me to hear clearly. Daniel didn't react, just looked at me for a long time, a look that was part affection, part apology, and part resignation. I turned away, walking out onto the porch, letting the rain hit my face. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and the sharp smell of paint from the newly erected billboard, which featured his face, radiant, confident, and alien. I stood there for a long time, listening to the thunder echo through the woods. In that moment, I understood. Nothing changes a person faster than recognition. And nothing is more lonely than loving someone who is slowly transforming into their own symbol. That night, the shelter was quiet. It was just me, Lucky, and the yellow lights reflecting on the damp cement floor. The rain had stopped, but the earth still smelled of lingering water. I sat down next to Lucky. He lifted his head to look at me, his eyes clouded with age. "Hey, old boy," I whispered softly, my voice catching. Lucky wagged his tail, tried to get up, but settled back down, his head resting on my lap. I stroked his graying fur, my hand trembling slightly. From inside, I heard the TV in the office. Daniel's familiar voice rang out, clear and bright, mixed with the host's laughter. "I've always believed that kindness can spread if it's told the right way." The quote echoed through the speakers, light and polished as if pre-written. I turned my face away, tears falling onto Lucky's coat. He licked my hand, his eyes a soothing thread connecting me to the past, where everything began with faith, not a contract. "We used to be good, didn't we?" I asked softly, as if speaking to myself. Lucky didn't reply, just whimpered softly, then lay still. The wind on the porch made the curtains sway gently. The light from the TV reflected on the window pane. Daniel's image laughing, his face so dazzling I no longer recognized him. The TV Daniel talked about, animal love, the inspirational journey, and the amazing team behind him. Behind him. Those two words choked me. I was that behind him. But now I was just the one hearing his voice echo through the walls. I hugged Lucky tighter, feeling his fur damp with sweat and the cold earth. His heartbeat grew weaker, slow and tired. In the small room, the TV continued. "We are preparing for our biggest project yet." The sentence stretched into a distant echo, blending with Lucky's soft breathing. I closed my eyes, seeing the image of the first Daniel, the man kneeling by the roadside, using his calloused hands to bandage a stray dog, his voice deep and gentle. That gaze once made me believe that kindness could save the world. But now, that look, when directed at me, was different. No longer soft, but sharp like a studio light, measuring and judging. I don't know how long I cried. I only know that when I opened my eyes, Lucky was fast asleep, his breathing steady and light. I stood up, walking into the living room. The TV screen was still bright. Daniel was shaking hands with the sponsor's representative. Two perfect smiles under the brilliant lights. I reached out and turned off the TV, but the light seemed imprinted on my eyes. In the darkness that returned, I realized the most painful thing wasn't his change, but that he no longer looked at me with the eyes of a partner, but as someone afraid I would ruin the image they were trying to build. I leaned against the wall, hearing the rain return to the tin roof, small and steady. I was beginning to fear not losing him, but fearing his gaze. The look that once carried faith now only reflected doubt. It made me feel small, like someone standing in the middle of a stage after the lights have gone out, when the audience has left and the celebrated person no longer turns to look back. Lucky whimpered softly in his sleep, a thin, faint sound. I bent down to stroke his head, whispering, "Go to sleep, boy. Everything will be quiet now." But I knew nothing would truly be quiet again. Not when love starts having an audience. I first met Maya during a meeting with the media team. She was nearly 10 years younger than me, with a short black haircut, a quick demeanor, and eyes that always knew when to look and when to defer. She worked for the sponsoring company, specializing in managing Daniel's image. When she walked in, the atmosphere in the room brightened instantly. She carried a confident energy, light yet impactful. "Daniel," she said, her voice clear and soft. "I've watched all your interview clips. You are truly unique. I've never met anyone like you." Daniel smiled, a smile I hadn't seen in a long time. Not the smile after a hard day's work, but the smile of a person being admired. I sat silently next to him, watching the scene like an outsider looking into a photograph. Maya was easy to talk to, sharp enough to make the other person want to share more. She asked Daniel about his inspiration, his childhood, about the energy that keeps him from ever giving up. He told his stories and she nodded, her eyes wide, her smile perfectly timed. Her every gesture made a person feel seen, and Daniel, perhaps, hadn't been seen that way in too long. When the meeting ended, she stood up to gather her papers and turned to me. "Amber, I heard you're the one who built the shelter with him from the start. That's amazing." I smiled faintly. "We just did small things." "Sometimes," she said, "the small things make the big person." Her voice was soft like praise, but her eyes were quick as a spotlight. I wasn't sure if it was genuine admiration or just well-trained courtesy. That evening, Daniel told me about Maya over dinner. He said she understands storytelling and helps him express himself better. I nodded, trying not to let my voice waver. "She's intelligent," I said. He smiled, his eyes lighting up. "And passionate. You know, she reminds me why I started." I wanted to ask, "And what about me? What do I remind you of?" But I didn't. I just focused on clearing the table, listening to the silverware clink softly like a clock ticking towards the inevitable. A week later, Evelyn visited the shelter. Daniel introduced Maya to his mother. The two women stood facing each other, one experienced, one young, both knowing how to smile at the right moment. Evelyn observed Maya, then turned to me, her voice sweet yet cold. "This girl is subtle. She understands my son better than I thought." Daniel smiled, a little embarrassed, but offered no rebuttal. Maya was only humble. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am." Evelyn placed her hand on Daniel's shoulder, her gaze warming in a way I rarely saw. I watched the scene, hearing the wind blow through the fence, and realized the space between me and them now included one more person. A person who reflected the image Daniel wanted to see. Brighter, lighter, and easier to love. Late that night, as I passed the office, light streamed from the screen. Daniel and Maya were reviewing an interview video, their laughter quiet, intimate, and completely unforced. I paused at the threshold, unwilling to break the scene, yet not brave enough to walk in. In the glass reflection, I saw 3 people. Them in the light, me in the shadows. And for the first time I wondered, when someone begins to be admired, do they also stop seeing the person who once believed in them with their whole heart? In the days that followed, I still arrived at the shelter early, as always, feeding the dogs, cleaning kennels, checking the medication logs. The work hadn't changed, only the distance between Daniel and me grew larger. He attended more meetings, came home later, the scent of strange cologne on his shirt replacing the familiar smell of dirt and disinfectant. Whenever I asked, he would just say, "It's just work." I nodded, silent, choosing to stay, trying to believe that love alone was enough. I believed love would keep him, just as we had once kept the abandoned dogs, with patience and hope. But my silence only made the distance clearer. Our dinners were now rarely whole. He ate while reading emails, occasionally smiling when a text came through. I asked, "Is that Maya?" He looked up, slightly startled, then offered a small smile. "She's scheduling a new shoot. Don't get ideas." "I'm not getting ideas," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "I'm just listening to the way you say her name." He didn't reply. There was only the sound of a spoon hitting the dish, small and sharp. Late that evening, I went out onto the porch. The light in the office was still on. Through the window frame, I saw Daniel leaning toward the laptop screen, his face radiant, like someone seeing his better self in a better world. Maya was on the other end of the call, her voice carrying through the speaker. "You truly are an inspiration, Daniel. I believe in you." I stood outside, listening to every word, and realized I had once said those exact words years ago. I gently closed the door, leaving the light inside for him, while I stepped into the darkness of the porch. In the sky, clouds drifted across the moon, the light faint, like the breath of someone about to fall asleep. I wondered if love also needs its own light to survive, or if it just needs one person willing to stand in the dark and believe. That night he didn't come to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night and found him slumped over his desk, his phone screen still bright with an unread text. I didn't touch it, just draped a thin blanket over his shoulders. In the yellow light, his face was peaceful, young as when we first fell in love. I lightly touched his hair, whispering, "I'm still here." But perhaps he didn't hear me, because he had traveled far, not by foot but by his gaze. A gaze directed towards somewhere else, where he was admired, seen, and reflected. I returned to the room and opened the window. The night air carried the scent of jasmine and the dampness of old rain. I sat down by the bed, my heart as empty as a house whose air had been drawn out. Lucky lay by my feet, breathing softly. I stroked him, feeling my hands grow cold. Blind love doesn't lead anyone out of the dark, I thought. It only makes us go deeper, believing that if we just love enough, the other person will see the way back. But some people, once they step into their own spotlight, will never turn around to find a hand. I glanced at the clock, almost midnight. The light in his room was still on, fragile and distant like a star drifting away from our shared sky. The evenings grew longer, and Daniel came home later than I had ever known. First, it was a few meetings, then the new project that he said was expanding the shelter's scale. "We'll have a new treatment wing, more staff, more opportunities," he'd say. But in his voice I heard a strange, hurried rhythm, not passion, but the intoxication of someone who had just touched the dazzling spotlight he once only dreamed of. I waited every night, the kitchen light staying on until the clock neared midnight. The dinner plate was cold, the smell of cooled meat mixed with the scent of old coffee, forming an atmosphere I was starting to grow accustomed to. When the door opened, I looked up, only to see him walk in, his coat damp with dew, his wrist faintly carrying a citrusy cologne. "Do you want something to eat?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "No, I've eaten. With the partners," he replied, putting his bag down. "With Maya?" I asked softly, unintentionally, but the words were out. He turned back, his eyes shifting, cold and unfamiliar, as if I had just committed an unforgivable offense. "Are you doubting me?" The room fell silent.
There was only the sound of the clock ticking, slow and heavy, like a heartbeat held captive in the chest. "I'm not doubting," I replied. "I just want to understand where you are in all of this." He looked at me for a long moment, then said, his voice deep and decisive, "I'm working, that's all." I nodded. No argument, no further questions. But in my heart, something felt like a door slowly closing, quietly, smoothly, soundless. But I knew it wouldn't open the same way again. The next day, Evelyn visited. I was making coffee when I heard her voice in the living room, low and clear. "Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for living your dream." I froze. The boiling water spilled over the pot, steaming profusely. I didn't need to look to know she was talking about me. Daniel sat opposite his mother, silent.
"You dedicated your youth to things no one saw," Evelyn continued. "Now that people recognize you, you let someone make you feel bad about it? No, you have the right to be proud." I heard Daniel exhale, a heavy sound. "Mom, I just don't want things to lose their original meaning." "Meaning?" Evelyn laughed softly. "Meaning doesn't feed anyone. And you are doing something valuable. You are not allowed to feel guilty just because someone refuses to understand." I walked out, placing the 2 coffee cups on the table. She smiled, as if she hadn't said anything bitter. "Amber, the coffee smells wonderful." I replied, "Yes, I'm used to making it." Daniel glanced at me, his eyes a mix of gratitude and exhaustion, but he didn't say anything more. In the afternoon, I went to the back kennels. Lucky was sleeping under the shade of a tree. I sat down, listening to the birds chirping above, the wind threading through the fence. Every sound was familiar, but my heart was no longer at peace. I thought about Daniel, about Evelyn, about holy words, about her words, living your dream. It was just that. His dream and mine no longer seemed to share the same shape. That evening when he returned, I didn't ask further questions. He kissed me lightly on the forehead, his breath carrying a faint scent of alcohol and cologne. "I'm exhausted," he said. "I know. I just need you to trust me." I nodded, not out of faith, but because I didn't want to see another cold look. When he went upstairs, I sat alone in the dark, watching the hallway light spill through the door. Something was slipping away, like sand through my fingers, smooth, painless, but impossible to hold. Lucky was starting to get sick. He refused to eat, walked with a limp, and coughed dryly in the middle of the night. The vet said his age was catching up, his heart was weak. He needed rest and consistent medication. Daniel listened, nodded, and promised to come home early to care for him with me. But those promises fell into a void, like unopened messages. The days passed in silence. I stayed by Lucky, forcing him to take his medicine, wiping him down, tucking him in. When his breathing became shallow, I placed my hand on his chest, feeling each slow beat, like a clock ticking in a house that was slowly growing colder. Outside, the rain fell lightly. Every drop felt like it was tapping into the emptiness in my heart. Daniel came home late. His shirt was damp. The new cologne mixed with the smell of alcohol. He walked past me, his eyes avoiding mine, his voice tired. "I just got back from signing a new ad deal. Things are moving further now." I just nodded, without asking. Inside, Lucky whimpered softly. He paused for a moment, then said, "I'll take him for a checkup tomorrow. I just need to make a few calls first." The office door closed. I heard the lock click, small but heavy. I returned to Lucky. He looked at me, his eyes cloudy but still gentle. I whispered, "It's okay. Mommy is here." I wiped his face with a warm towel, placing a bowl of water next to him. When I looked up, The light from Daniel's room still filtered through the crack under the door, thin and distant. That night the rain stopped. The insects chirped softly in the dark. I went to get water, and as I passed the office door, I heard his voice, low and almost trembling. "I miss you too." In that instant, I froze. The simple sentence, yet as heavy as the sound of something shattering in my chest. I backed away, walking as quietly as possible, afraid the wooden floorboards might hear my heart race. Inside the room, his voice continued, softer, gentler, as if speaking to someone far away through a screen. I didn't hear the rest, and I didn't want to. I went back to our room and closed the door. I didn't cry, just sat down by the bed, hugging my knees, my back against the wall. On the other side of the wall, Lucky whimpered softly in his sleep, his breaths weak and broken.
I wanted to rush over, to cling to that small warmth, the only real thing left in this house. The light under the door crack went out. The house was submerged in silence. Not the silence of peace, but of a soundless collapse. I lay down beside Lucky, pressing my face against his back. His gray fur was still warm. I whispered, "Go to sleep, Lucky. Everything will be over soon." But my heart didn't believe it. In the darkness, I clearly saw Daniel's image appear in my memory. The man kneeling in the mud, smiling kindly as he bandaged a small creature. I closed my eyes, trying to hold on to that image as if grasping the last breath of a dream. No sound of breaking is as loud as a heart cracking in silence. And tonight, I heard every piece of it clearly, falling inside my chest, unseen, unheard, only by me, and the old dog, still dreaming of a place where it doesn't rain anymore.
I maintained the habit of cooking dinner, even though the table now only held 2 chairs. One for me, one for him. Empty, but still neatly set, like a ritual to remind myself that something used to exist there. Every night, I still scooped an extra serving for him, placing it beside the glass he liked. I kept his portion, even knowing he wouldn't make it home in time. Or if he did, he would only stand in the kitchen, gliding past the scent of the food like a stranger visiting an old house. Outside the window, dusk fell early. Rain streamed through the streetlights, small drops, tapping against the glass like a rhythmic beat. I looked at the clock, 8:30, then 9. The phone vibrated on the table, its screen lighting up the darkness. "I'm sorry. Please don't make this hard." 7 words, not long, no punctuation, just an empty coldness. I read it a second time, then set the phone down. Water on the stove began to boil over, the fierce sputtering drowning out the beat of my own heart. I turned off the burner, sat down, and tried to breathe deeply. The phrase, "Please don't make this hard," echoed like a polite, packaged farewell. It wasn't quite the end, but there was no longer a beginning to wait for. A moment later, the door opened. Evelyn walked in, her coat still damp with rain. Before I could speak, she looked around the kitchen, her eyes settling on the table set for 2. "You still leave a plate for him?" Her voice flat and cold. I gave a small nod. I just didn't want Lucky to think no one was home to eat with him. She curled her lip, a look of half smile, half pity. "Amber, you have to understand. Daniel is doing something bigger than this shelter. You can't hold on to him forever with cold dinners." I stayed silent. I didn't want to fight. But Evelyn didn't stop. "You chose the wrong person." The sentence fell softly, like a spoon tapping a dish, but the sound resonated deep in my chest. She sat down, wiping her hands with a napkin, Her voice lower. "Daniel needs someone who believes in his dream. You only worry about losing him." I looked straight into her eyes. "Because I'm the only one who still sees him losing himself." Evelyn paused, then stood up. Do you really think you can save anyone? She left, letting the door tap softly behind her. I looked back at the table. His portion was completely cold. The oil on the surface of the soup had solidified, reflecting the pale ceiling light like a tiny, unrippled pond. Lucky lay at my feet, looking up, his eyes sad and gentle, as if he understood that everything in this house was slowly dissolving. Not loudly, not angrily, but cracking little by little. I stood up, took his plate, and poured the food away. The liquid hit the side of the sink with a dry, hollow sound. I suddenly thought, perhaps happiness breaks apart like that too. Not from one powerful blow, but from small, repeated collisions, until there's nothing left to hold its original shape. On the phone, his message was still bright. I'm sorry. Please don't make this hard. I didn't delete it, nor did I reply. I just turned off the light, letting the kitchen sink into a gentle darkness, where everything was quiet and most honest. The next morning, Lucky didn't wake up. He lay peacefully in his old blanket, his head resting on my arm as if he were still sleeping. I called out softly. There was no response. Outside, the sky was gray. The wind blew through the fence, rustling a few dry leaves. The smell of the night rain lingered in the air, cold and damp, as if the whole world were holding its breath. I sat beside Lucky for a long time. I didn't cry. I just stroked his spine, feeling the fur that had become dry and stiff. In that silence, I heard the clock ticking, slow and steady. Time kept moving, only I was stranded in a moment where no one else stood. In the afternoon, I buried him under the tree in the backyard. The soil was soft, with green moss and the wild daisies Daniel had planted that first year. I used the rusty shovel, digging through each layer of earth. Every scoop of the spade felt like it was cutting through the air, through memory, through something deeper than grief. I laid Lucky down, wrapped him in his old wool blanket. Before covering him, I looked at him one last time. His head tilted gently, his pose still peaceful, exactly as he was the day Daniel first bandaged him on that muddy road years ago. I whispered softly, "Sleep now, Lucky. You held us together for too long." I shoveled the dirt, layer upon layer, until the ground was flat. The rain began to fall, sparse at first, then heavy. I went inside and got our wedding photo, the only one I still kept in a silver frame. In the picture, Daniel was looking at me, his eyes bright, and I was smiling, my hand resting on his shoulder. It was sunny that day, and Lucky lay right at our feet, looking like a tiny comma of happiness. I placed the photo next to the tree, on the freshly leveled earth. The rain soaked my hair and my clothes, but I didn't go inside. I sat down, letting the water run over my face, carrying a salty taste that was impossible to distinguish, rainwater or tears, I couldn't be sure. The wind picked up, tapping softly against the frame, blurring the glass. I put my hand on it, my palm cold as metal. The rain poured down, thick and heavy, as if trying to erase every trace of what once existed. I looked up at the sky, seeing everything blur into a hazy light and the sound of water hitting the ground. In that instant, a thought flashed across my mind, light yet painful as a knife cut. I don't know if I'm burying the dog or the man I used to love. Because Lucky wasn't just the first dog. He was the remainder of us, of the mornings filled with laughter, the afternoons by the fence, of the man I once believed would never change. The rain kept falling, each drop hitting the wet earth and silently dissolving.
I backed away, watching the small plot of land slowly turn into a puddle. On the surface of the water, the photo frame reflected the gray sky and my own face, distorted in the rainwater. I spoke softly,
not knowing who I was talking to. Perhaps, one day, you will remember this place, but by then, I won't be waiting anymore. I turned and went inside, closing the door. The smell of wet earth still clung to my hands, haunting my breath. In the dim kitchen, I sat down on the chair listening to the rain drumming on the tin roof, steady, real, and unrelenting.
One gloomy morning, our old SUV suddenly died right in the middle of the road. Daniel was driving and I was in the back seat, holding the shelter's files. He tapped the steering wheel, sighing. The electrical system must be acting up again. I nodded, saying nothing. The air in the car was thick, like residual steam after a long rain. He called an acquaintance, Mr. Harris's garage, an old friend of my father's. A small place, located on a suburban road lined with pine trees, where mechanics still wiped their hands with oily rags and spoke more with their eyes than with words. When the car was towed into the workshop, Mr. Harris stepped out, his tanned face breaking into a kind smile. "Well, Daniel, haven't seen you in a while." "The car stalled," Daniel said, sounding tired. "Could you take a look?" "Sure thing," he nodded, wiping his hands. "I'll check the dash cam, see if anything unusual happened. Sometimes the sensor system gets stuck because of the electrics." Daniel smiled, nodding. "Do whatever you need to, as long as it starts again." I didn't pay much attention. I just saw Daniel scrolling through his phone, typing a quick message, his face tense yet eager. When Mr. Harris returned, Daniel spoke. "I need to borrow another car for a few days, if that's possible. I have a trip I need to arrange." "Where are you going?" "Just a short retreat. My mother and Lila want to try a spa package on the South Coast." He paused for half a second, then added, "Maya is coming along to film some material." I looked up. Not because of surprise, but because of the way he spoke, casual, as if that name had naturally become part of the family. "Maya?" I asked. "She's helping film the new campaign," he said quickly, avoiding my gaze. "This trip needs promotional footage. Don't worry about it." I said nothing. I just looked outside where Mr. Harris was bent under the hood, the smoke from the oil blending with the thin mist. The sound of machinery, the metallic clicks, the distant rain, all merged into a melancholy soundscape, the sound that only precedes a truth beginning to surface from the deepest part of the ground. When he signed the papers to borrow the car, I noticed his hand was shaking slightly. I couldn't tell if it was from fatigue or from knowing he was lying to someone. Maybe me, maybe himself. That night he left. I stood on the doorstep, watching the silver car disappear into the fog. The rain started again, thin and steady. Lucky was no longer at my feet. It was just me and the wind blowing through the empty space. I walked inside, seeing the car repair receipt still on the table, along with the small box Mr. Harris had included, an old dashcam memory card. I almost ignored it, thinking it held nothing important. But something in the air made me stop. I picked up the card, flipping it back and forth between my fingers. It was small, light, but cold. And in that moment, a silent intuition ran down my spine. The intuition that something was waiting for me inside the screen's dim light. 3 days later, the car was returned to the garage. Daniel sent me a short text. "Car's fine, don't worry." I looked at the screen. My heart no longer ached like before. Perhaps the worry was simply tired, or perhaps I had stopped hoping that anything else would be fixed along with that car. Mr. Harris called my father, asking him to pick it up. My dad drove the car back, his demeanor slow and calm as always. When I came out to greet him, he only said, "The car runs well again, but there's this." From his pocket, he pulled out a small memory card wrapped in tinfoil. "It was in the glove compartment. It might be yours." I watched the small object sit on the kitchen counter, between 2 steaming coffee cups. The light shone on it, giving it a cold silver hue. I was about to say,
throw it away, but my father plugged it into the laptop, his hands slow but firm. He didn't look at me, just opened the default folder. The screen lit up, and the sound came instantly. The rustle of the wind through the mic, then the sound of someone laughing. Daniel's voice. Deep, familiar, but lighter, more carefree. Amidst the laughter, a woman's voice, Maya. "How long do you think they'll buy these charity videos?" Then Daniel's voice, a touch of joking cynicism. "As long as the money is coming in, they'll call kindness a miracle." Then the laughter of both of them, long and interwoven. My father paused, his hand still on the keyboard. I could hear his breathing grow heavier, not from anger but from disappointment. On the screen, the image shook slightly. Daniel's face appeared in the frame, the ocean light casting a side glow, that smile, the smile that used to belong to me. Maya leaned her head in, touching his shoulder. Their kiss wasn't long, just a fleeting moment, enough to suffocate the viewer's heart. I stood still. The room was so silent I could hear the clock on the wall. My father turned off the video, pulled out the memory card. No one spoke. He just placed it on the table, his voice hoarse. "Amber, there are some things others won't dare show you, but the truth, it always finds its way." I nodded, my eyes fixed on the black screen that had just gone dark. The reflection of myself in it, blurred, shaking, and looking like a stranger. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the memory card still on the table. Outside, the rain began to fall softly. The lights reflected on the window pane, glittering like unshed tears. I picked up the card, the coldness running through my palm. Sometimes, the truth doesn't need anyone to find it, I thought. It just waits for someone brave enough to open it. I played the video again, but this time, not out of pain, but to look straight at it. To look straight at the man I once believed in. The man who had now learned to smile for the camera without needing to look my way. Outside, the rain grew heavier, blending with the distant sound of waves echoing back from memory.
I turned off the laptop, closed the door, and knew, from here on, there was nothing left to hide. The news spread faster than any wind I had ever known. After just 2 days, the video clip from the memory card appeared online. No one knew who posted it, only that it was shared thousands of times with the headline, "The Fake Hero." The images that once moved people to tears were now replayed in ironic context. Daniel smiling, Maya touching his shoulder, and the quote, "As long as the money is coming in, they'll call kindness a miracle," echoing like a public confession. My phone rang all morning. Newspapers, reporters, old acquaintances. I turned it off, sitting and looking out at the backyard, where the plot of land burying Lucky now sprouted a few young blades of grass. I wondered, if he were still alive, would he recognize that the owner who once knelt to bandage him was no longer the same person? Daniel lost his reputation. The first sponsor announced a temporary suspension of partnership pending investigation. A day later, other contracts withdrew simultaneously. The promotional photos were taken down from digital billboards, his name deleted from campaigns. People called him a performing hypocrite. And Maya? She disappeared. No message, no address. All that remained were a locked social media page and a few vague articles mentioning the mystery woman in the scandal. Evelyn and Lila came to see me one morning, their faces pale. She didn't look at me, only said curtly, "We have to move out of here for a while. The press is surrounding the house. The neighbors look at us like we're criminals." I nodded. "Yes, I understand." She stood up, her voice trembling but still firm. "No matter what, he is still my son." I replied, "I know." And I loved him too. She didn't answer, just walked out the door, pulling Lila with her. As their car drove away, I realized this was the first time the house felt truly empty. Late afternoon, my phone rang, his number. I let it ring 4 times before picking up. On the other end was heavy breathing, then Daniel's voice, hoarse and exhausted, like someone who had just swum through a storm. Amber, I've lost everything.
I remained silent, listening to the wind whistling through the receiver. Somewhere, there was the sound of a car horn, people passing by. But his voice was submerged within those sounds. So lonely that I could imagine him sitting alone in an empty room, the light casting shadows on his tired face, still clutching the phone as if clinging to the last thing left. I don't know who I've become, he continued. They look at me like a monster, and maybe they're right. I tightened my grip on the phone. You have yourself left, Daniel. The part of you that once knelt down in the rain, remember? He gave a small, warped laugh, shattering in the speaker. That part died with Lucky. I closed my eyes. I didn't speak, because sometimes comfort only adds weight to someone who is sinking. After the call, I sat in the kitchen, the sunset light casting patchy reflections on the wall. On the table, the wet photo frame from the day I buried Lucky was still there, the scratched glass reflecting my blurred, shaking image, looking like a stranger. I touched it and understood. The truth didn't just steal Daniel's reputation. It stripped bare the last illusion I still held, that love could save someone who didn't want to be saved. I received the divorce papers from the lawyer on a foggy morning. A white sheet of paper, 2 necessary signatures. His, mine. I looked down at the lines of text, my hand shaking slightly, not from regret, but because every stroke of the pen felt like severing a thread that had long been rotten. No tears, no drama, just the stillness of something that had ended a long time ago. I picked up the pen, signed my name neatly, then folded the paper. The soft sound of the paper folding was like a door quietly shutting. I thought that moment would hurt, but it didn't. There was only a sense of emptiness and a little peace,
like someone finally stepping out of a room that had run out of air. I felt no hatred, sought no blame, and needed no one to know who was right. I signed the divorce papers. No hatred, no tears. Because in the end, love doesn't die from betrayal. It dies when one person stops trying. In the afternoon, I walked past the old house. The front door was slightly ajar, the curtains swaying with the wind. On the doorstep, Daniel sat, hunched over, like someone who had traveled too far for too long and no longer knew the way home. He wore his old jacket, his head bowed, his hands clasped. His hair was longer, messy and sweaty. When he heard my footsteps, he looked up. His eyes were sunken, exhausted, as if all the light within him had dissipated with his fame. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hoarse and broken. "I lost everything, including you." I stopped a few feet away from him. There was no longer anger, just a kind of sadness that had been worn smooth until it had no sharp edges left. "No, Daniel," I said softly. "You didn't lose me. You just walked so far that you stopped recognizing who you were." He bowed his head. A gust of wind blew through, carrying the scent of grass and damp wood. I looked around. The house was empty now. The walls stained. The photo frame gone. The crack in the foundation, still in the same place. The only difference was that no one was trying to fix it anymore. He muttered something, so softly the wind carried it away. I didn't ask him to repeat it. Some apologies don't need to be heard, because the person giving them no longer truly believes in themselves. I walked toward the yard, pausing to look at the patch of ground where Lucky used to sunbathe. Wild daisies grew along the fence, painfully white. I thought about everything, the afternoons with laughter, the silent nights, the words he once spoke and the things he never brought himself to say. Everything in the end was reduced to the sight of the man slumped over in front of the house he once called home. I didn't move closer, nor did I turn away immediately. I only spoke, softly and clearly, letting the wind take it if necessary. I'm not seeking revenge. I'm just giving you back to yourself, the person you forgot. He didn't reply. I saw the first drop of rain fall onto his hand, then spread across his hair. The rain came quickly, like all the rains in our lives, unexpected, without warning, and no one seeking shelter anymore. I turned my back and walked away. The dirt road was saturated, mud clinging to my shoes. Behind me, I heard the door close, softly, like someone whispering a final farewell. And I knew. I wasn't walking away out of anger, but because, for the first time in years, I was brave enough to leave a place that had held me with expired love.
A week later, Daniel asked to see me. The meeting took place at a small cafe near the city courthouse, a place people often go to wait, or to finalize something. The morning was sunny but not quite warm. I sat at a table on the patio, my hands around a coffee cup, watching the steam vanish in the breeze. When he arrived, I almost didn't recognize him. His coat was wrinkled, his face unshaven, his eyes hollowed. He no longer carried the air of the man who stood before cameras, nor the confidence that once convinced the world he could save everything. He sat down, gripping an untouched cup tightly, his voice hoarse, lost, and so honest that it made me forget my resentment. I once wanted to save the world. Now I just wish someone would save me. I remained silent. I only looked at him, without judgment. There are moments when words are useless. Silence is the clearest mirror. The wind swept across the patio, carrying a napkin from the table. He watched it go, then spoke slowly, almost whispering. I don't know when things went wrong. I kept thinking if I did well enough, if everyone knew about it, kindness would multiply. But in the end, I only multiplied my own ego. I gave a gentle nod, quiet, just a nod. No forgiveness, no accusation. The silence between us lengthened, no longer tense, but heavy, like the dust settled on old memories. He started to say something else, but his voice choked. I didn't come to ask you to come back, he said, his eyes on the street. I just didn't want things to end in silence. I looked at him for a long time, then replied, Silence doesn't kill anyone, Daniel. It just forces us to hear ourselves. He gave a small, weary laugh devoid of any self-defense. Then he stood up, nodded a farewell, and walked away into the early sun. His shadow stretched long on the pavement, blending into the crowd. I didn't watch him go. That afternoon, my lawyer filed the lawsuit. A simple, short document, demanding that Daniel publicly apologize for his deceptive behavior and the damage to our reputation. Not for money, not for fame. Just because some things had to be spoken, not to inflict pain, but to restore the truth he had lost. I recalled his face in the cafe this morning, the man who once carried both light and darkness, now sitting there, stripped bare amidst the consequences of his own actions. I didn't feel joy nor pain, only a quiet sadness, the sadness of someone who once believed in a dream and was now signing her name to end it the right way. On my desk, the paper lay beside a cooling cup of tea. I placed my hand on the document, taking a deep breath. Outside, the sky was clearer, but the scent of lingering rain was still in the air, the smell of something about to be washed clean. The interview took place in a small studio at the local TV station. I didn't intend to watch, but I did. The screen lit up, studio lights shining on Daniel's face, haggard, older than his age. No expensive suit, no stage smile. Just a wrinkled shirt, and his hands tightly clasped over his knees,
as if he were holding himself together to keep from collapsing. The host asked gently, without aggression, "Is there anything you want to say to the public? The people who once believed in you?" Daniel took a deep breath. A moment of silence stretched, long enough to make one feel breathless. Then he spoke, his voice hoarse but clear. "I let fame kill kindness." There was no defense in that statement. No justification, not a hint of self-pity. Just a truth laid bare, heavy and raw. He continued, looking straight into the camera lens. "I started out of compassion, but then I wanted recognition. And once I got it, I forgot why I started. I confused doing the right thing with being seen doing the right thing." The entire studio was silent. No applause. No whistles like usual on such shows. Just a long void, where people didn't know how to react. The host bowed her head, saying softly, "Thank you for your honesty." Daniel managed a small smile, the tired but most genuine smile I had seen on him in years. I watched until the end, without blinking. As the screen faded, I could still see his shadow in my mind. The man who once walked through the light, got lost in the shadows, and was now trying to stand still in the gray area of atonement. I turned off the TV, and the room sank into silence. The sunset light streamed through the window, pale gold, falling onto the floor where Lucky used to lie. I thought, perhaps he finally heard his own voice. The small voice that fame had made him deaf to. I poured more water into my tea, the warmth spreading gently through my hands. There was no more anger, only a sense of closure. Not an end, but a return to the right place for everything. Justice is not revenge. It is the truth being heard. I repeated that sentence in my head, then set the cup down. Outside, the rain had just stopped, the wet streets reflecting the dim lights. I stood up, pulled the curtains open, and let the hazy light stream in. A light that wasn't dazzling, but enough to see everything clearly. I moved back to my father's house on an early autumn morning. The old house was just as I remembered, the wood siding slightly faded, the windows opening up to the backyard where lavender still bloomed despite being untended. My father greeted me with a kind smile. No questions, no blame. He just placed his hand on my shoulder and said softly, "It's good that you're home." I started over with small things, a part-time accounting job in a small-town office, and in the evenings, I went to the pottery studio across the hill. People say learning pottery is learning acceptance, that some things must break to take shape. I didn't ask further. I just sat at the wheel, my hands covered in clay, the cool sensation seeping into my palms as if I were touching another life. Quieter, truer. Each time I smoothed the curve of a vase, the glaze spread, revealing the shape of a small paw print. At first I thought it was just a smudge from my finger, but then, it happened every time. Each finished piece bore a small mark, faint, but distinct, as if someone had gently touched it when I wasn't looking. Once I mentioned it to my father. "It's strange. The mark just appears. It looks exactly like Lucky's old footprint on the dirt floor." He smiled without looking up. "Maybe he's still lingering around here. You're just learning how to see him." In the afternoons, the sunlight slid through the window, clay dust dancing in the air. I listened to the old radio playing classic jazz, the steady click of the clock. Everything was so ordinary, it was almost sacred. There were no arguments, no dazzling lights from cameras. Just the whirring of the pottery wheel, the quiet breath of someone learning how to live again. One morning, the old neighbor, Mr. Bennett, stopped by. He had lived next door to my father for 40 years. He stood at the door, holding a bouquet of wildflowers and a basket of apples. "I heard someone moved back to this place," he smiled, his voice deep and raspy. "Didn't think I'd see the light on in the window again." I invited him in. He looked around the kitchen, saying softly, "The house is warm again. Maybe Lucky knows that too." I smiled. No denial, no affirmation. I simply poured him a cup of tea, then sat by the window, watching the sun filter through the steam. I realized that some comebacks don't require grand beginnings or anyone to witness them. They just need a lit kitchen, a hand kneading clay, and enough warmth to thaw a heart that had been cold for too long. That afternoon the sky was cloudy, but the wind was strangely warm. I had just finished a small pottery piece, white glaze with a faint blue tint, the surface still damp. On the table lay an old cloth soaked with water and a few drops of cool tea. Everything was still, as if time had stopped here. When I opened the door, a small bouquet was neatly placed on the doorstep. Nothing extravagant, just a few wild daisies, mixed with thin sprigs of dried lavender, tied with a delicate piece of twine. In the middle of the bouquet was a small card, the paper slightly curved from the dew. For the hands that know how to heal. I picked it up, my heart beating softly. The handwriting was slanted, familiar somehow. Simple, low-key, not trying to leave an impression. There was no name, no return address. I sat down on the steps, the flowers in my lap, the breeze pushing the scent of lavender into my hair. For a moment, I thought of Colin, the man who helped me at the studio, who often laughed when I accidentally broke a cup. He once said, "Everyone who does pottery has broken something they love. The important thing is whether you have the patience to reshape it." It could be him. It might not be. But strangely, I didn't need to know. Some gifts don't demand explanation. They just need to be received in silence. I placed the bouquet on the table, next to the still wet vase, then washed my hands under the faucet. The water flowed over them, washing away the remaining layer of clay, lightly, softly, like erasing the calluses of an old chapter of life. Outside, the afternoon light slipped through the tree branches, falling into fragile golden fragments. I watched them settle on the bouquet. The light made the whole room glow, warm, as if someone had just turned on a lamp on a gloomy day. I smiled faintly, not because of explosive happiness, but because of the recognition of this small piece. After years of chasing someone else, I had finally returned to myself, and in that moment, I realized a simple truth, one enough to bring tears to my eyes. Not everyone who comes after is meant to take the place of the one before. Some people just arrive to remind you that you can still be loved. I stood up, opened the window, letting the scent of flowers spread throughout the house. In the kitchen, the kettle was whistling. I returned to the pottery wheel, placing my hands on a new block of clay. It was still soft, still warm, just like my heart. The rescue shelter lay deep in the valley, where the dirt road had been eroded by rain, and weeds grew wild like an untended green carpet. The old wooden sign was tilted, the words "Haven for Paws" almost completely faded, leaving only a few blurred streaks of paint, like a memory. Daniel returned, alone. No luxury car, no film crew, no camera lights. Just a faded backpack and mud-splattered shoes. He stepped through the rusted fence, the hinges screeching like a greeting from a place that once knew him at his very best. The grass grew knee-high, the old kennels were empty. A few tin panels had blown loose, the wind whistling through them, creating a mournful sound like a sigh. He stopped at the corner of the yard, where the small shrine for Lucky used to be. Lucky's silver collar was still there, nestled in the weeds, slightly tarnished. He crouched down, picked it up, brushed off the dust, and gently placed it back on the shrine, where the wax from an old candle still remained. The wind blew through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and wild daisies. Daniel stood still, his hand touching the old photo of Lucky, the dog with the gentle eyes, the happily curled tail, the small light that once connected him and me when everything was simple. He whispered something, very softly, like a prayer only the earth and sky could hear. Maybe it was, "I'm sorry." Or maybe,
Thank you. A moment later, he opened his bag and took out a thick envelope, my name scribbled across it. The paper was yellowed, the corner slightly crumpled, but inside with a complete transfer documents for the rescue shelter. No lawyers, no conditions, just a short line written in blue ink. Thank you for teaching me how to love correctly. I received the envelope on a late winter afternoon while rearranging my pottery shelves in the room. The postman said, "The sender asked for no reply." I opened it, my hands trembling slightly. Each piece of paper, each word,
seemed to whisper something distant, not an apology, but a quiet form of atonement. I placed the envelope by the window. The thin light streamed through the glass, illuminating the sentence he wrote. The blue ink reflected, shimmering like water. Outside it began to snow. The first flakes fell slowly, dissolving on the damp wood frame. I sat down, my hand still on the envelope. There was something light in my heart. Not joy, but an unnamed sense of peace. He had finally returned. Not to say I love you, but to return the best part of himself to the place where it began. The next morning the snow had stopped. The ground was covered in a thin, smooth white layer like unwritten paper. I drove to the old shelter. The iron gate was silent, just as it had been for years. When I opened the gate, the hinges let out a long squeal and a few puppies rushed out from somewhere. They were small, fluffy, their tails wagging relentlessly. One had light golden fur, just like Lucky when he was a puppy. I crouched down, my hand touching their warm fur, listening to the small, noisy, vibrant sound of breathing. The sound I once thought I would never hear again. They ran circles around me, chasing each other across the snow, leaving tiny, smudged paw prints on the ground. Each step reminded me, life still existed here, even if it had been forgotten. I looked around. The wooden kennels were still old, the fence still tilted, but in the early morning light everything seemed softened. No longer cold, no longer empty. Only a peace as light as the breath of the land that had been forgiven. I was clearing some old trash bags when I heard a slight movement by the fence. A figure stood there wearing a dark coat, their face obscured by the sun. He placed a bag of dog food next to the gate, said nothing, made no gesture, just gave a slight bow and turned away. His footsteps left faint prints in the snow, stretching toward the sloping road leading to the town. I stood still, watching until his shadow disappeared behind the pine trees. I didn't call out, didn't follow. Some final encounters don't need words, because everything that needed to be said had been written in action. I simply opened the bag, finding it full of the exact kind of food Lucky used to love, chicken flavor, a subtle hint of mint. I gave a soft chuckle. Tears didn't fall, but my eyes stung. I placed the old bowl in the middle of the yard. The puppies gathered around it, barking loudly. On the snow, their paw prints trailed together, messy, innocent, full of life. I took a picture, not to post, but just to keep. I stood there for a long time until the sunlight began to shift to a pale yellow. The wind blew through the fence, swaying the grass, creating a soft sound like the sigh of a winter nearing its end. And in that moment I clearly heard my own voice, not loud, just enough for the wind to carry. Not every ending requires a new beginning. Sometimes all that's needed is for the heart to be at peace. I closed the gate, hearing the soft click of the iron lock. It wasn't the sound of separation, but the sound of a circle closing at the right time. Ahead, the road was still white with snow, quiet and bright. I took a deep breath, walking slowly, my heart light, as if everything that had once weighed heavily was now just warm breath on an ordinary morning. Perhaps all of us have walked through a season of loss, a place where love was fractured, where we were forced to let go of the hand we thought we would hold forever. But then, When we finally stand in that empty space, we realize no one is truly alone forever. Because as long as you still know how to love, as long as you still know how to trust, there is always a path leading toward the light. If this story reminded you of someone, or simply made you want to take a quiet moment to breathe, please leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from. I truly read every single word. And if you want to continue this journey with more stories like this, stories about family, heartbreak, and the eventual rebirth of the heart, please hit that subscribe button. Because who knows, somewhere within each story, you might just find yourself in a moment that is tiny but real, and enough to keep you warm.